Hello and welcome to a new process video. In this video, I'm going to take you through the entire process of my recent painting with the Parrot apprentices. I'm going to show you how I mix colors, what supplies I'm using, and how I basically get the paper prepared for lots of layering of watercolor mediums like gouache without it buckling. So right now what I'm doing is I'm preparing the paper, and I like to use cotton paper. So far, once I've started using 100% cotton paper, I don't feel like using any other paper. I find the cotton paper extremely amazing for watercolor mediums. It absorbs so many layers so well, and the texture afterwards, especially with gouache, is just so delicious and satisfying every step of the way. I'm sticking the paper onto my wooden desk easel. The paper is size A3, but the desk easel is size A2, which is twice as large as the A3, so it's perfect. And I'm using some really cheap washi tape from Temu. I can't resist a celestial pattern, so when I saw this box of, I think there was 24 rolls, all kinds of celestial patterns, I couldn't resist. And because I intend to use the washi tape temporarily and discard of it after the painting was done, I was looking for a cheap option. I didn't want to spend a lot of money on the washi tape if I was just going to throw it away after the painting was done. So yeah, Temu was the best option for that. And after the paper is stuck onto the easel, I just make sure that there's no gaps and the tape isn't lifting, because I want there to be a really nice and neat border, and the firmer it is stuck onto the wood, the less it's going to warp and the more layers I can put onto the painting. If you hear my parrot in the background, who is the inspiration for this painting, please don't mind him. He is very noisy, very loud, and he is usually in the background whenever I'm trying to record a video. So in my sketchbook, I drew a thumbnail of a bunch of paintings that I had ideas of, and I planned to either make into a little illustration or a full painting on a larger surface like this. And it's done in pencil in my sketchbook, and it just helps me think of the big composition, the big picture. And I do a little more drawings and sketches of how I want the parrots to be posed and what objects would be in the scene, like the hat, the notebook, all in my sketchbook. Very rough and very loose, just for me to get something, just to start off with something on the final paper like this. I'm using a regular HB pencil, and I'm just sketching in with very loosely the main areas. Before sketching, actually, the first thing I did was I drew a guideline to separate the paper into a grid of 3 equal parts. I think I picked up this from somewhere. It's called the rule of thirds, and it helps you, especially with landscape painting, it helps you properly lay out an interesting composition: background, middle ground, the focal point, and the foreground. So after the sketch is done, and it's not very detailed, I just wanted to put the main objects, what the focal point is, and a little bit of the background and foreground. Before starting the final painting, I like to do an underpainting with some Hansa yellow medium gouache. Sometimes I use yellow ochre, but for this one I decided to go with a lighter color, a lighter yellow color, because the brightest parts of the painting, I would want it to be a bright yellow. Yeah, so basically that's why I do the underpainting, is because the blank spaces where there is going to be no paint, I like to use the surface of the paper itself. So this was the perfect color for like a bright uh, a sunny day, which I intend for the parrots to be directly on the parrots to make them the focal point. And then I just start painting. I'm using this round brush from Germany. uh, by the way, their brushes are amazing and extremely high quality. um, this is one of my favorite brushes. It's a round brush 10, I think. And it feels like a pin. That's how amazingly the brush hair can hold a lot of paint, and it feels like a pin. Except for the underpainting, where I used a lot of water and really thinned down the gouache paint. I don't use too much of water. I like to create a thick consistency of more paint, especially when I'm using gouache. I don't use much of its watercolor characteristics. So you can see I'm kind of treating it like acrylic or oil, and I'm only depending on its characteristic of being a really opaque medium. So I'm going in and filling the background color by color, and I don't do any blending either. I really enjoy the look of how colors, or like a bunch of colors, a scene looks just with the colors placed next to each other instead of smoothly blended. If there was a gradient, I would still place the different shades next to each other to create a gradient. But it's just my personal um, preference. I really enjoy looking at each shade of color placed next to each other, and I also enjoy painting that. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm not using the watercolor characteristics of gouache. I'm treating it like acrylic or oil, where you would paint each section instead of using a light wash, the way you would with watercolor. So in the background, there's very little details, and there's a lot of abstractness and simple impressions of things. Instead of painting the whole tree, and then the shadow of the tree, and then the leaves on the tree, I just paint shapes, very chaotic shapes, to create impressions of the tree, of the leaves, and even of the shadow. Also, recently I've been using a lot of lavender from the Daniel Smith gouache range for shadows of the paint. I've been studying the color theory and trying to apply what I've learned about values and hue and saturation, and chroma. I've been trying to apply those concepts into my paintings to make better paintings and be able to tell a story better in a painting. And in one of those lessons, I learned that a yellow or a bright orange source of light often creates purple shadows. So, and that's why they're complementary on the color wheel. That's why they're complementary colors. So I've been using that a lot because I like to paint forest scenes, and instead of painting the shadows just a dark green, I like to make the scene more dynamic and maybe even realistic, more believable, even though it's a fantasy scene. I like to create more believable shadows and basically just more interest in the painting instead of using a dark green shadow or a dark blue shadow, just adding black wherever there's a shadow. Instead of doing that, I'm starting to use the complementary colors. So usually I paint forest or a forest scene or a tree, and the light source is the sun. So instead of painting dark green shadows or dark brown shadows, I've been using more interesting colors like lavender. So you find in the background, towards the top of the trees where they are in shadow, I'm using lavender and then creating a smooth gradient to orange and then to bright yellow raw sienna mixed with some white to create the highlights on the tree trunk where the sun will directly be striking. And to create the focal point on the parrots, the rest of the scene is going to be in shadow, so they're going to have darker values, and the parrot itself, to make sure the focus is on them and to guide the viewer's eye towards the parrots, I'm going to paint them in a direct space of sunlight, like a patch on the grass through the leaves. Maybe there's an opening in the tree canopies where the sun is shining directly on them, and this gives them more interest, so they will have brighter highlights, white of the paper, white paint straight out of the tube, and more detail, much more detail, the most amount of detail compared to the rest of the scene. Another thing I learned about painting interesting forest scenes, especially scenes that are not flat, is that all the trees are not green. The sky is not 100% blue, and the ground is not 100% brown or 100% green if there's grass there. There's many shades. I used cascade green, spring green, viridian. I used some lavender. I used burnt umber, raw sienna, and even cerulean blue for different areas of the grass. The goal of that is to make each little square inch of the painting look like a painting all on its own. And that's one of the biggest things I'm learning about painting on larger surfaces, is to treat each square inch of the painting as a little painting on its own. So previously I'm much more comfortable painting in my sketchbook, and my sketchbook is just the largest sketchbook I've worked on is A4, which is not very large, and so I've mostly painted like on a miniature scale, and it was just more manageable for me and less overwhelming compared to a large canvas like A3 and larger. I didn't know where to start. I just used to feel overwhelmed by all that space. I didn't know what to fill it with, and I didn't know anything about composition and the fact that you don't have to paint details on every area of the painting, only the focal point. So this year, one of my goals was to try painting on larger surfaces outside of my sketchbook, and I think so far I have done that. Taking the leap was scary and overwhelming, and it did lead to like art block for a few days, but I'm glad that I did challenge myself. And so far this year I painted 4 complete paintings on A3, which is a large painting for me. And when I went back to my sketchbook after painting those large paintings, I felt instead the urge to go back to painting on an A3 surface, and now I actually want to paint on larger surfaces like A2. Yeah, so the moral of the story is encourage yourself to take challenges, face the thing that you've been afraid of the most, especially in creativity. That's where the biggest growth is going to happen, and that's where you might create something that is a masterpiece, or you learn something that will take you down the path to creating your masterpiece. I painted the middle ground, and slowly now I moved to the foreground here, and this was actually the most challenging part of this painting. For some reason, I love painting the background, I love painting the focal point and stuff, but as it comes to the foreground, I started to get tired of the painting, because this must have been the 3rd day of painting. I think I painted this in 3 sittings across 3 days, about 2 hours each day. Yeah, so around the third day, I maybe started to get tired of the painting and wanting to start something different and look at something different. I think my favorite part of painting the story aspect of this illustration was adding the little mysterious text on the paper, like painting the scroll itself, but also painting the text on the paper. I used cobalt blue for this, also from the Daniel Smith gouache range, and I mixed a lot of titanium white to make this very bright, eerie blue color. And that's the color I used also for the symbol on the spellbook, which I almost painted runes on the spellbook, like Nordic runes or maybe a Greek symbol. But recently I've been researching a bit of my own culture, which is like Hinduism and Rajasthan, from Jaipur specifically. I've been researching patterns and symbols from my culture to use in my fantasy paintings, because it's very common to see Nordic runes and Greek mythology, Western folklore in fantasy. And I love that kind of thing. I love elves and the whole fairy court. But I want to start incorporating some of my own cultural storytelling into my paintings, because these are things that I've grown up with and want to include in my stories. The other little detail brush I used was a round brush 0. It's a very tiny brush. It's also from Kum, Germany, from the faded line. And for the text, I used a liner brush, a rigger brush, also from Kum, Germany, and the size is 0. It's the tiniest brushes I have, and for the tiniest details. And eventually I did cover up the eyes after removing the washi tape. I took a step back from the painting and I saw some things that I wanted to change, specifically the eyes that was in the background. I didn't turn out how I wanted it to, so I just repainted over it. Another reason why I like gouache, I find it much more forgiving than watercolor. With watercolor, I guess you could lift the paint, but you can't really do anything after it's dried unless you use a very opaque watercolor. But that's why I think gouache is very forgiving. Another reason why I like it. And yeah, that's the painting. If you want to see a list of the actual colors I used, you can see in the description, and I have a written tutorial on my Patreon. Prints of this painting is also available on my website, as well as my other A3 paintings. Yeah, and so now I just, after the painting is done and after I admired it for a bit and signed it and made sure there's nothing I want to change about it, I keep it in a plastic sleeve, and either I display it or I keep it away for a bit. If I display it, I like to admire it, but after a while I get tired of it. Yeah, and so this painting will be with me at Comic-Con next year, if all goes according to plan. And I had a lot of fun painting these parrots. My parrot has been inspiring me a lot, and I want to paint more scenes with these two rascals and their misadventures. Thank you so much for making it through this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be making more videos like this with in-depth process explanations, so subscribe if you're into that. And I'll see you in the next video.